Welcome to Engage and Secure, the podcast redefining the future of cybersecurity by focusing on its most critical element, people. Powered by OutThink, the world's first AI-driven human risk management platform, we bring you thought-provoking discussions with industry leaders, innovators, and experts. I'm your host, Fred Menachem. Welcome to the Engage and Secure podcast brought to you by OutThink. I'm your host, of course, Fred Menachem, and today we're taking a different lens on cybersecurity. It's one that stretches across cultures, industries, and leadership styles. I'm very excited that we're joined by somebody with a truly global view. David G., born in Australia and raised in a deeply multicultural world. David's built and led cybersecurity teams across the world, including in Australia, Hong Kong, Japan, China, and the United States. He's been at the helm of some of the most high-pressure environments, transforming organizations across banking, insurance, and pharmaceuticals. And David's a renowned cybersecurity thought leader. He's the author of Aspiring CIO and CISO, which was just named one of the 10 must-reads for security leaders. He writes for CIO, CISO, and AICD board magazines, and he shares insights that really shape the industry. He also serves as the ambassador for CISAC Critical Infrastructure Australia, helping protect critical national assets. And if that wasn't enough, his second book, soon to be released, A Day in the Life of a CISO, is set to release in Q4 2025. So before we get into David's cybersecurity career, we need to understand the man behind the leader. So David, first of all, I'm so excited to have you. Welcome to the show. How you doing?
Hey, thanks, Fred. I'm feeling a bit humbled by that introduction, but thank you.
Well, listen, I could have even talked about more, so I tried to keep it a little bit low key, man. But listen, you've done a lot of things, and you're a great guy. I'm glad that we had the chance to get to know each other, and I'm excited to dive into this. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Let's go.
All right. So first of all, obviously, David, you weren't born into this world as a cybersecurity leader. Like many folks, you had an interesting trajectory and a journey. So let's start at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about your childhood. What was your childhood like?
Oh gosh, where do I start? I always talk about being the fat spoiled kid. I was fortunate in a way, Fred, because unfortunate in a way. My dad died when I was 2, right? So deeply personal thing. My dad died of cancer and had 3 boys, 6, 4, and 2, and I was adopted by my uncle at the age of 2. My uncle then raised me. He also raised my 2 brothers and paid for them, for their upbringing and their education and their weddings and their first car. And my dad was such a saint. My uncle was such a saint to do that. So I came from an incredibly generous family that was always giving and doing charity work. And my dad was the president of the Red Cross and the Chinese Society and the Rotary clubs. And I was always surrounded by people in my house at the parties, and my dad was always doing charity hostings and stuff. So I think I grew up with an incredible background that I still imprinted on me today. So your father, you said, was involved with all those organizations, but he died when you were 2, right? Oh, sorry. Yeah, when I say my dad, sorry, because I was 2 years old, my uncle was my dad.
That's right. Because your uncle, exactly. Yeah. Your uncle really raised you.
He raised me. No, I think I was. My parents couldn't have kids, so I was very spoiled, and I call myself sort of fat chubby kid. I was a fat chubby kid, very spoiled. Whatever I wanted, whatever toys I wanted, I got, right. And I was my parents were well to do, so I've had the silver spoon experience, and I've had also the experience of my parents then losing their money and coming out the other end. So I've on that basis, mate, I try to stay as humble as I can because life's a cycle. You don't know exactly.
Of course. And look, I've been there too. Life is ups and downs, and we learn from experiences. And look, like we don't want life to be hard, but that's life. We go through our things, and sometimes the hardest things are also the most, opportunity to learn. In fact, my father died much later. I was 20, but I think there's different, things that come from that, but it's always a loss and nothing changes. So you were, though, born in Australia, of course. You're 3rd generation Chinese Australian, but you grew up. This is the most interesting thing for me. And I like to tell folks, really give us a picture of Darwin, because it was an interesting, highly multicultural environment, but not typical multicultural environment, not the kind that people are used to. So why don't you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I was up there recently, 2 weeks ago, Fred. First time in 50 years for me to go back there. And so 50 years. And for me, it reminded me a lot of my, my DNA and the fact that, I grew up and then in a class of school kids, there'd be me and then an Aboriginal kid, then a half Aboriginal kid, then a Greek person, and then a white person, right? And so Aboriginals were about 20, 30% of the population. Chinese were about 10%. It was really, really a balanced population. You didn't lock your doors at night. You didn't lock your cars. You just, live a good life. Everybody coexisted well. And I didn't encounter racism at all as a kid till I went to Sydney. Then people started calling me names and, not nice names. And I was like, well, hang on. How do I fight them all? Because this is not right. But it's an interesting place. And to me, I think the upbringing I had, was because everybody speaks their mind. Integrity is really important. If someone says rubbish, you'll say bullshit real fast. You don't hold people. Everybody's special. Everybody's sort of equal. We had that really egalitarianism view of the world, right? We all have an opportunity, and also maybe a little bit naive, right? Which is, I could do anything. I could do anything I wanted to choose to do, and my parents told me that all my life.
Well, and we'll get into this later, but from what I understand and from our conversations, look, you didn't obviously there's always issues that occur, right? There's racism, there's that bamboo ceiling we'll talk about a little bit later. But the thing is, because of that egalitarian mentality, you didn't let anything stop you. And I think that's amazing. And that's a great segue into the fat kid, man. So we talked, you bring up this fat kid and it's a much more, nuanced than people, are hearing this fat kid, because it's complicated, right? About how we feel about ourselves. So you were, you want to talk about that? The chubby story, I think you called it. Being bullied, and then how you overcame that.
Yeah. Now, my brothers were the ones getting the book prizes. They go to the, the end of the year ceremonies to get the book prizes, and I never did. They were the one athletics that were running in, basketball, running races, Aussie rules football, kicking the ball around. They were better than I was and this sort of stuff. But I was the fat, chubby kid who sort of, ate the ice creams and wasn't very good at it. But being sent to Sydney for school and going to college at the age of 12 in boarding school,
right,
was transformative to me, because it meant I had to grow up really fast. I had to stand on my own feet, encounter racism and encounter people not being nice to me, and then be resilient, and then figure out, okay, actually, how do I had to fight back answers. How do I not be the fat kid? How do I be good at sports? How do I, start to study, which I'll talk about as well, Fred, the changing myself from my own perceptions of myself and actually reinventing myself. So I think I learned about that, when I was 12. How do I start to be different to what I am? And I don't like what I am. How do I be somebody else, if that makes sense?
It's interesting because leaders often have these stories. They're sometimes afraid to say it. And it's interesting because you met Flavius Pleshu, who's the CEO of OutThink. And when I interviewed Flavius, he talked about a similar story, right? Feeling inferior, feeling like he wasn't talented, and he overcame that like you did. And I think that's sort of, and tell me if I don't want to put words in your mouth, which I tend to sometimes do, not purposely, but, I assume that there was some level of imposter syndrome. I think every leader struggles with that. Would you say that on some level would be accurate?
So. In my whole career, you had that, because, I'll talk about that later on if you like, but I was always thrust into leadership roles and managing people older than me. Even from my very first job, I was managing, as in insurance, in working branches, and then managing people that were 20, 30 years older than I was, and they knew more than I did. And I was wearing a nice suit and I didn't know shit, right? So how do I make them come along with me, at least to, humor me and listen to my advice, and learn from them? Because it had to be, you've got to be generous about that, because they know more about life than you do. But yeah, that imposter syndrome is real, but having natural confidence to overcome that, and then work with people to figure out, how do I make the most of this? How do I get the right outcomes for the organization by changing myself, not being one note. Yeah.
And I think that leaders tend to, all people have some level of insecurities, and that's a normal human condition. But I think leaders, because there's that imposter syndrome with many, that forces you to compensate, right? And to fight even harder. And let me ask you this, David, you think you felt like an underdog in many respects?
I don't carry that. I'm aware. Like I said, I was made consciously aware I'm different when I was 12. I was constantly, because I grew up thinking I'm white. Okay,
right.
I'm
three generations in Australia, right?
Yeah, I'm part of Australia. And they're like, oh no, you're
right.
your English is pretty good, David. And I said, well, I'm born here. Like my dad's born here, my grandfather's born here. Come on. And then I jokingly would say, but I could speak, really good Aboriginal, but I can't speak Chinese, which I learned later in life. But that was the truth, right? Is that you tended to assimilate to this environment. So
right.
yeah, that's fair. But I think I was always, given I was trying to be the fat kid, I was trying to be better than anybody else. That wasn't. Therefore, I knew there was something there about being different, but actually, I just wanted to be better. And so, whether it was on the sports field or actually in the classroom, how do I be better? How do I compete?
So, and I'm going to move on to the next component in a moment, but I'm guessing you're talking about in Darwin, you probably felt more it was about the fat kid than the multicultural thing, right? Because you didn't experience it as much there. That was later, correct?
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
So it was now I did have a question. You did talk to me and to us when we met last time about your father's story. Now I'm assuming you're talking about your uncle, right? Who was basically your
correct.
Your
yes.
father. And I know that he had a lot of interesting background, maybe some hardships and stuff, and that also molded you in many ways. Do you want to talk just briefly about that?
Yeah, look, he was a successful businessman, as I mentioned, and a leader in the community, and a proud businessman that owned shops and supermarkets. And before the big supermarkets came in town, we had the biggest one in town. I kind of saw this strong integrity. I saw him giving, and I then I saw him actually then the other end of the scale. Fred, I mentioned, he business didn't go well. He moved to Sydney. People cheated him. He lost his money. And then he became unwell. Whether it was diabetes and heart issues, and it was all connected, right? If your life's not good, you get depression, and I saw that, and it troubled me because I saw the proud man that became small, and I did whatever I could to help him in my little way as a 20-year-old. To help him financially and help him support, his transition, because I think that's you see a proud person, you want to keep them proud if you can, help build them up again. But yeah, I've always remembered that. I think it's a very humbling part of seeing some people change.
And unfortunately, right, life situations can cause hardship can affect people in different ways. Now, let me ask you this: so you were 20, and so you lost your dad at 2. Did he pass away as well?
He passed away, but that was much later. But I think I skipped over a piece with maybe to mention that I met my wife when I was 17, I think, Fred. So I got married at 20, had a kid at 20.
Right, your kid, right?
Yeah, and then I think we're married 45, 46 years, and still she's I love her very much. She's a beautiful woman, but we made choices even back then as a young kid to go ahead with that wedding, because we could have chosen not to do that and do something different. But you make choices, and I think it helps you. It made me grow up really fast, from being a naughty boy running around doing different things, right? To settling down.
You out of being a naughty boy,
yeah,
right?
and being a dad, right? Being a dad, and then so that I learned a lot about leadership from being a dad, and I may have, if you allow me to relate a story around having a kid, then actually trying to. Yeah, please. Trying to figure out, okay, how do I, I've got this 20-year-old, had it got the kid, you a bit awkward, you're not sure what to do. So we did the medical, first aid course, and then we did a course to teach my son how to read. And the course was interesting because it was all about teaching a kid how to be brilliant. And it was, play your kid Mozart when they're 1 year old, show them flashcards, and don't say doggy, say this is a dashang, this is a wind mariner, and so you showed them the depth of biology. We showed my son Nathan Picasso, Monet, Renoir paintings. So we gave him this ability. So when he was 1 year old, he could read, he could swim. He later played the Suzuki violin. We just gave him so much input. So I realized quickly as a leader that sort of leadership skills around people development is that you get branded a certain thing. You're not the smartest. You're middle or you're low or whatever, and then you can change that. This is all kind of false. And so as a leader, I've embraced that to say, take any performer I can make them better. Because you just need to find the right buttons to press. And I learned that as a 20-year-old.
And I think you're making a great point because, and I know from personal experience, look, our brains, many people have different brains, right? Not everybody's brain's the same. Some people have learning disabilities and all that, but our brains are amazing. We don't use probably a 10% of our brain. I don't know what the numbers are, so I'm just making that up. But to your point, yes, we can all, right? We can shift how we learn and our brains can grow because we have that capacity. And I think what you did with your kid was you gave him the ability to grow his brain, to grow his brain. And you didn't let anybody tell you that wasn't possible.
And right now, we society is facing the challenge of, AI exceeding our intelligence. How do we live with AI in a fashion that we're not actually outsourced to them? So it's another challenge all of us now face around living that AI environment.
So, by the way, I want to move to another point, getting to business a bit, but I do want to say you have 3 grandkids as well, right?
I got 2 grandkids. So
2 grandkids.
Very proud. My kids are all grown up, and I think they got 7 degrees between the 3 of them. So they've done well. And they all got their second mortgages and the like. So life's been good for me, I think. But we've had our hard years, I think, where we had no money and we had to struggle and have second jobs or doing different businesses my wife ran to pay the mortgages. And if I recall back when I graduated from university, Fred, the mortgages were 15-16% interest. So
I remember in the 80s, right?
Yeah, so
70s, late 70s,
right? Yeah. In late 70s. So the taking a job on in my first after graduating and not taking the job with the low interest loans because banks were offering me a job with half rate interest,
right,
8%, 7%. It was really tempting, and I said, no, if I do that, I'll never leave. I don't want to do that because I'll be trapped. I want to be. Yes, I've got responsibilities. Yes, I want to have a mortgage. I want to have look after my family, but I want to be able to change industries so I can, and maybe. And I wasn't sure what I want to do when I grow up, but I knew I didn't want to be stuck in one place.
So let's, on that note, a great segue. So I love this particular topic because I'll preface it with this. My father was a partner with Ernst & Young. So I love talking about E&Y, by the way, and it was Ernst & Ernst when I was growing up, then Ernst & Winnie and Ernst & Young. So I have a lot of love and history with Ernst & Young. So I know that you went and worked for Ernst & Young, and I'm not going to tell your story, you can tell yourself, but how you rose in your career and the trajectory and how you said, I'm going to be at this point, and people, questioned it, but you kind of did it. So what's the story there?
Gosh, Fred, so graduated, first job, managing insurance, managing people, counter calls, phone calls, processing claims, underwriting, all that sort of stuff. And then after 6 months, I did my first IT project, which was one of those ones where they say this is going to be, used for a few years. It was used for 15 years afterwards. It was my first sort of, time experience doing requirements and testing and getting the team to deliver training and the like. So I kind of hooked by this idea. How do I do this? This is mainframe days, right? Mainframe, IBM, Armdale. And then
and what years was this, by the way? Let me stop you because
this is in the 80s. So, and then my second job, I moved to Fairfax, which, ran the biggest newspapers in Sydney Morning Herald, Financial Reviews and television stations. And I was a business analyst. So I was continuing on what I was doing, doing process charting and looking at the bigger picture of how we make improvements. And then I started getting asked to go do coding. So I started doing coding. This was the very first IBM PCs. So PC-DOS version 1, Ethernet, Novell networking, all that sort of side. I learned how to cable, to play with modems and support that. So I run the help desk and create applications. And I was doing so many different things. And IT was over there doing something else. They were doing accounting systems, and I was doing all the fun stuff with a small team. And I got hooked because I think I was in the sort of mini computer world, right? Mini PC world. And I moved to Pioneer Concrete, Fred, 3-4 years later. And PC manager, team of 3, putting in PCs into organizations, which was novel back then. Okay. So the organization used to have
Of course it was novel. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's actually, you shared PCs, right? You had one PC for 5 or
Of course, I remember, by the way, I'll stop you for just one moment because you're making me laugh. I remember in elementary school, because you're a bit older than me, maybe 10 years, I think, but I shouldn't throw that out there. Sorry about that. But I'm 53 for anybody listening, but all joking aside, I remember they would take us to play with computers like DOS and program. I think I lasted about 30 minutes and, never touch it again. But on a joking note, my father, when he was at Ernst & Young, through the 80s, he would always tell everybody that computers were just a fad. Anyhow, I thought that was funny. But on that note, I say that, to segue into what you were saying, that it wasn't common. So that's what the point you were making. Right.
So rolling it out. And then I think I got promoted to be application development manager and support manager at the age of 27. They fired the guy who was in charge and they promoted me to manage a team of 45, I think it was. And everybody was much more experienced than I was. They had master's degrees in development. They had, PhDs. And again, I had imposter syndrome. How do I overcome that? How do I then, work through that to run, large scale projects? And I had to learn. I'd go back and study, do a postgrad software engineering certificate. Mm-hmm. But then I think, they fired the boss. CIO got fired.
You're talking about Ernst? Or different? No,
this before. Okay. This was Pioneer Concrete. Ernst Young was next. So Pioneer Concrete, Pioneer International was bricks and plasterboard and all that sort of stuff, quarries, and it was a blokey business. But what was interesting is that they fired this guy, and then suddenly of this big team, then they fired the CIO and said, "No, David, you're too young for this because you're only 29. But we're going to ask you to go and you run this transformation with Tony White, and you're going to figure out how to change this place." And we then we had no budget, no team. And we're going to say, okay, we're going to get fired next because there's, we've got nothing around us. Then how do we go and then transform the organization? This is my first transformation exercise ever. So look at every process, change every system. It's a 3.5-year program to change everything, from back office to production systems, putting computers in the trucks. So computers in the trucks with floppy disks, so it wasn't actually wide. They weren't wired, okay? Right. They weren't wired. And that was radical change. We had the organization go from number 3 or 4 in the market to number 1 in that industry on the back of that change. So that's when I moved to EY. I finished that transformation. They offered me a job over there, and I as you said, hinted, I kind of, was... what's the word, confident, and then I said, well, look, you're going to make me a partner within 2 years. And I was coming in as a senior consultant, when there's a senior consultant, then director, then principal, then partner. Within 2 years, you're going to make you a partner. And the guy looked at me and smiled and said, why not? So I guess, cut a long story short, I did get offered a partnership, and they offered me the works, the MBA and the study tour and a signing bonus, and you're not going to be a salaried partner, you'll be a full partner next month. And they really wanted me to join, and that's when I made my career choice, Fred, to be a CIO, to say that I don't want to do this tactical stuff, working for clients for slices. I want to actually do the strategy and see it through. I want to see I want to see the value. I want to see the beef. I want to see the all the fun stuff. So not just do the upfront piece. Yeah.
And that's when you start, right? And that so on that note, I want to get through a few more things here, and then we have so much to talk about today. So I could do 5 episodes with you, by the way. So, but I did want you to talk for a moment, because we're going to get into East-West in the next, in a few minutes. But I do want to talk for a moment. You spoke to me about the bamboo ceiling, right? And what it was, and how you really, and it's a great story, about Japan. You had an amazing story about what you did there, how you shifted shifted the culture in many senses. I think you were a pioneer, and maybe you never thought about that, but you really made some difference. Talk about that for a moment.
Yeah. So Fred, I think from one stage going over to Lilly as a CIO, and then they promised me to send me through an MBA, and then over to China, to Shanghai, to Hong Kong, to Japan, etc. So which I did. I was the CEO for Australia, New Zealand, then China, then Australia, Asia Pacific, then Japan, then the USA, and I expanded large teams and relatively small teams with no budget. But going to Japan was interesting, because I came as the CIO. It was the second largest market for Lilly globally, and I think Lilly's probably number 2 in America right now for pharmaceuticals. It was interesting because the team was poor. The team was, you can't go and fire people. There was no mechanism to fire people. But I realized there was, You need to fix the hardware and the software and the peopleware. You had to fix all that to fix it because it was an issue. But the people was interesting because Japan's very male dominated. You ask for some CVs and you get this pile of 100 CVs of males that are 35 years old with the same black suit, white shirt. And I said at the time, look, my definition of a talent is actually that they get stuff done, they solve problems, they're bilingual or trilingual, they can speak English and Japanese and maybe Chinese and other languages, they can work internationally. And that's my criteria. So if you can find those people for me, I don't care if they're black or white or young or old or male or female, bring them to me. And so I changed that whole paradigm shift to get people to resign that were bad. They had to resign. I couldn't fire them. And then go and hire some great people. So in that 4 years in Lilly, my success was actually getting new leaders in the place who now, themselves CIOs and CISOs and being a net exporter to the business of about 25% of my team was being pulled into the business to say, we want to take Fred because he's amazing, because he gets stuff done and he's...
Why, thank you.
but it was just something that I love doing because it just meant I could make a contribution broader than IT. I could actually help to the IT agenda by having people on the other side who understood what we're trying to get to as well. So you became a net exporter, which was really unique.
And I think, look, and I think in many ways, we talked about this the other day, look, you were a pioneer because Japan in those days, and we're going to move on in moments of the East-West distinction, but Japan in those days, that was not cultural. It wasn't, they didn't necessarily understand conceptually, right? It was mostly, Japanese men. And so what you did there is, number one, you created a much more successful company from a revenue, perspective, and it was, running much better. But that was really a major shift that really was probably because of the way that you were raised in Darwin, and you didn't even, right? I mean, wouldn't that be some truth to that?
Perhaps, yeah. So the naivety aspect of it, I suppose, Fred, would be sure. And then, how do I then work with these people who fundamentally, Japanese don't like Chinese. Okay, so how do I
a separate podcast, right?
Yeah, how do I come across as a credible leader that they want to follow? And then they would love to follow. So, from being suspicious about me to getting to, the point where they love working for me, right? That's my goal. I want them to love working for me. I don't want them to feel that I'm telling what to do and they afraid of me. That's not a good philosophy for people. People should follow you if they want to follow you.
So I want to get in for a moment before we move to the next section, because I know one of the things that I know that you really did was you had a leadership style shift from solo player to making the entire team better. And maybe we can get into that a little bit later, unless you want to make one point about that, because I want to go into your book for a minute, and then
sure. I Fred does my book. The leadership algorithm I came across during my travels was interesting, because it was all about how do you make people the best version of themselves. Going back to my son's story, and then I learned in Japan around how you identifying your skills, knowledge, experience, behavior, and finding one thing for each of those dimensions that were going to make you a better leader. 2 jobs ahead, but it really was. That was one aspect. The other aspect, I think, Fred, that I talk about in my book is around this algorithm, which is, you inherit a team, right? So you can't fire them all, usually, right? And how do you then take David and Fred, make sure they have good teamwork, so it's a multiplication, not a negative, right, between the two of us, and make Fred the best version of himself. So Fred can, he's a 6 out of 10, but I want Fred to be an 8 out of 10. And then David's a 5. He's not that good, but how do I make David a 7? So as a leader, if I can coach each of you to be your best version, understand where your gaps are, but you're not seeing yourself because you're not sure, and then make sure you've got great teamwork because there's a multiplication. I look great because I'm getting amazing output and outcomes from you, this team. And so we have all these fancy theories, but if we break it down, that's the fundamental leadership response, right? Making people their best versions and getting great outcomes and having teamwork across. You can call it when we call it, but if you do that right, basics, you get success.
which is a great segue, although to get into the books. But I want to say just one thing quickly. I remember a story you told me that, once you overcame and became this basketball star, you were first, just taking the ball, you wanted to shoot. And then it's similar to what you're saying here. And then one day you realized, or somebody said something, you had to pass the ball. And by passing the ball, you were building a better team. And that's sort of, I think, really what you're talking about here, right? How do you build a team? Because one person can't carry a team. And you make somebody better by passing the ball.
Correct.
And then the output of the team is going to be better. Am I getting that right?
You're right. And it's uncomfortable, Fred, because if you when I was in high school, I was the star shooter. In all the teams, I was in the top team, and I was pass David the ball. David was the best shooter, passing the ball. So when I got to the last 2 years, I was on the first team, and I was the captain. And then my coach said to me, Coach, David, can you just pass the ball? Don't shoot it. I want you to make everybody else better. And I was really uncomfortable with this idea, because it was like, well, I'm the best shooter. Why would I pass the ball? Then, okay, get it. He wants me to be uncomfortable to make others better. Damn. Okay. And I didn't succeed properly in high school to that challenge. I tried, and I kept in my head, which is, if I do this well, then actually the team's better than me being the star. And how do I do that? How do I share the love, so to speak, around with others? And so it's a challenge I've embraced my whole life.
And look, I think a lot of people do, but that's how you that's how you build a better team, because at the end of the day, it's you build more output. So on that note, because I want to move into East versus West, but I want to talk for a moment about you, man. You wrote a book. You have another one coming out now. I was reading the other day. It just popped into my email or something, or I was looking up something exciting. It was from an article from HelpNet Security, and it was called The CISO's Bookshelf. And tell me if I'm right. I think I wrote it down, the 10 must reads for security leaders. And lo and behold, I see David G's book, man. What was it? Tell us, just give us the quick. There we go, man. Aspiring CIO and CISO. So give us the quick bullet points, man. What's it about? And then hopefully people will read it.
Yeah, well, first I was tickled pink to get this, nominated for this curated list of must reads, and I wasn't told. I didn't nominate for that. They didn't tell me that I was on the list. I saw a colleague of mine, Deborah Baker, who wrote a book too, and her name was there, and she was writing, "Thank you very much for being." And I was a Saturday morning at 5:00, and I was like, "That's so cool. Deborah's on the list. Hang on, I'm on the list as well." And so it was a lovely shock to have that, to have to be acknowledged. But I think the book is a whole bunch of stories I have around, learning to be a leader. And I think about the journey, right? Leadership's all about climbing this mountain. And when I did the cover with the publishing company, I said, look, it's a pretty slippery slope. It gets to the top of the mountain. It's sort of death zone. The air is very rare and thin, and it's kind of sharp rocks and cold, and it's not very nice, which is the way it works is the C-suite, right? Now, not everybody wants to be the very top, but being a base camp,
sure.
Okay. So the book's all around how do you actually be your best version of yourself to get yourself to close to the top. And I'm the gondola. I'm helping you, guide you there, to take you through understanding yourself, understanding your gaps, trying to think 2 jobs ahead, to figure out what are your skills, knowledge, experience, behavior you need to grow to, and then navigating your way through interview processes. And so I've got lots of guidance around, getting through. I talk about, for example, getting through 17 interviews for one job I got.
Oh my God! Wow.
Yeah. And so you got to walk in very positive. You think, my God, this is my 7th interview. Do they want to hire me or not? And how to be positive and walk in and make sure you provide the right sort of eye contact and charm, and the right questions back. And then once you get the job, that's the easy part, and the hard part comes of doing the work. Because it's stressful. It's first 90 days is all about you branding. So I talk about your 90-day plan as a CIO and CISO. What do you need to do, and what you need to not do? Because you're creating your plan for yourself that the team goes, oh, that's what David is doing. He's actually being really accountable, trying to be strategic, looking at the team, looking at the threats, and then figuring out where we need to tweak things. And then, the whole book then talks around survival skills, because I think, we all know the CISOs don't last more than 2 or 3 years normally.
Right.
And so how do you survive and thrive? Yeah.
Well, I would suggest that folks pick up that book. I started reading it. I'm going to finish it, and we're going to come back again and talk more about it. And I just want to give you a quick mention, because A Day in the Life of a CISO is coming up. It's going to be released in Q4 2025. So we'll look forward to hearing more about that. I don't know if you want a quick 10, 15 seconds to mention something.
Look, I wanted to take what I've done with this book, and then go the next step further, which is to say, I invited. Firstly, said 24 CISOs and CISO types that are around the world, from Japan, Australia, Singapore, UK, America, India, and then so tell us your story. Tell us what you care about in cybersecurity that is not textbook like, but all more around. Okay, Fred's the CISO at this organization, cares about cybersecurity strategy, or cares about managing regulators. Tell us that story. Why do you care about that? And I introduced Fred, and then I asked you to, talk about that area, which is your passion. So what it is many ways is actually really good guidance for the next generation. Going on with my thing, which is not just David talking, it's actually the 25 other CISOs talking about their experience, their playbook, how they manage stress, how they've grown from, imposter syndrome. And so there's common themes there, but in different voices, right? Everybody's slightly different. Some are humorous, some are more serious. It's been such a fun exercise to do with so many different leaders around the world. I've learned from that exercise myself.
And we'll get into more about that, because that's behavioral, right? How different people think, and how to messages are palatable and all that. But I want to move on here, because we have a lot to talk about, and this is so interesting to me. I mean, you build security teams all over the world, and you have an experience that a lot of people don't, because you've built teams in the East and the West, and you've kind of straddled both sides of the world. So, what's the biggest difference you think between leading in the East versus the West? If there could be one or two things that you would throw out there.
I think there's many things. I mean, Asia Pacific Japan is many cultures with many differences, right? I've mentioned about Japan, Korea, very different to each other. China's very different to each other. So you've got to understand the inherent differences around that, and then embrace those differences. So I often will talk about, look at India. I mean, India's a complex society, and I've visited there maybe 8-10 times. I've done a Buddhist pilgrimage, all kinds of things that I've done in my life. But will I ever understand India properly? No, never. But I have to try to appreciate the fact that there's a layer there, Fred, that there's a level of caste, right? And there's 1,200 caste levels in India. 1,200, which is unbelievable to understand, right? So you got this caste level, you got the class level, you got the religion on top of that. Okay, so as an outsider, trying to appreciate the subtle differences within countries and understand that. But generally speaking, you'd say that at a top 10,000 foot level, the people in the East are much more hierarchically bound. They will literally bow to you, nod their heads, be more listening to what you say. In the West, of course, it's like Australia, of course. No, you're wrong, David, you're wrong, and challenge you and push back on things. And I like both. I do like to have the pushback. I do like to have so when I'm in the East, I encourage them to challenge me and tell them I'm wrong. Please tell me I'm wrong. And in the West, I'm asking them to cooperate. Hey, work together. And that'd be so. Take positions. I want to have a view, but actually, then we make a decision. We made a decision. Okay, let's go back again. And so it's about trying to understand the subtle differences and get them to the outcomes, right? And so to me, that's just true diversity. You're getting people thinking differently, acting differently, but then getting to better outcomes by having that thinking different.
And you talked about hierarchy versus open debate, right?
Yeah, it's very true, and people just do that naturally because that's the way society's formed. They're more subservient. They will bow physically. They won't ask. They're very very detail oriented. If you're opening a data center or doing something, they'll be very detailed where you stand and to the second and minute the speech is made, ribbon is cut. While in the West, we'd wing it, right? We just go along with we're going to do this, and we'll pop the champagne. Done. So it's a very different society, different way of thinking.
It's funny because I was in Korea not too long ago, and my friends kept saying, listen, different culturally, this and that. Although I think you always break barriers, and I, Koreans tend to be much more disciplined. They're not pushing with questions and all that. It's following. One thing I couldn't believe was that people waited in line. I was like, oh my God, and so patiently. I was like, who the heck? I was like, I'm trying to cut the line, sneak in on the side. It was actually in some sense, beautiful because people weren't beating each other up. They weren't screaming at each other. And, they had a level of discipline. And I think, to be frank with you, sometimes in the West, we can use a little more of that. And then, both cultures have something to offer, but I enjoyed it, truly.
Well, Fred, a little story. I was at the Tokyo Dome in Japan, and there was I think it's Paul McCartney concert.
And nice. Paul McCartney in Japan, man. That's pretty damn cool.
So the concert finishes, the light comes on. Now, normally concerts, people just jump out and run down the stairs, right? And, just push your way through. No, sure. Not in Japan. In Japan, the top row goes first, and then they file down, and everybody waits for them to come down. And the whole stadium just waits orderly while top comes down, the next row comes down. So and then they'll take the garbage with them as well. They'll pick up the garbage. And so you're going, oh my gosh, this is so orderly. We can actually get out faster. No one's pushing. No one's falling over. It's really stunningly different. And
sure.
Compared to a normal concert you go to, and you just fight your way through the crowd. But it works. It works.
So, talking about security, in Asia and the West, what's the difference there? Relationships and policy, and how does it all work together?
It's true. It depends where you are. If you're in Japan, and Japan, I guess, suffers from the fact that they do speak English and learn English at school, but they don't speak it very well. And that's not disrespectful. That's just true. So therefore, the cyber companies, got to be more accommodating for the language, number one. The people don't go and study cybersecurity in university, so they get a graduate who's a generalist, and they've got to train them. So you'd say that in countries like Japan, then you'd find, there's lots of nation level issues because they've got Korea nearby and China nearby who don't always like them, and so they get attacked naturally because they're trying to bring them down. And I think probably guessing underreported. Okay, that things have been hacked, but never report that. So that's an interesting cultural aspect in Japan that probably doesn't get spoken about too much. But every country is a little bit different, right? You just got to be aware of the politics and where this country, Singapore, stands with China's relationship. And,
sure.
Geopolitics matter, right? They matter.
They matter. Listen, I've always been engaged on some level in geopolitics through the media, and of course they matter. People need to understand them, and I think that not enough people do because it drives everything. In a sense.
Yeah, and if you go back to the cyber intel piece, right? If you're in America or in Australia, you can pick up a number of subscriptions or companies that help you get intel. In China, you can't. And so you got to find other mechanisms through government, or semi-government, to find information because no one's going to share that information readily. And so it's like it's kind of like gray here and then black. There's nothing happening. No intel.
I will tell you something, and I want to get into something a little bit lighter, but I kind of think it's a bit fun to talk about. But I will say this. Look, at the end of the day, I've traveled a lot all over the world, to the East as well. And people are people at the end of the day. I've always broken barriers, right? Look, yes, I think all human beings put people in a box, but I think the brilliant part is taking them out after that, right? Once you meet people one-on-one, and I've always experienced that. And I think we're more alike than we're different. And I think people want to be around unique, different people. They're just nervous because they don't understand them. And I think that's why the divisions happen so much. But once we meet people from all walks of life, it really makes us, and I think, you can speak to that for just a moment, but I think that makes us more interesting, better leaders, and that type of thing. Would you agree with that?
I agree, Fred. Being accepting of the differences doesn't matter if you're traveling to Jerusalem, to Hong Kong, to Shanghai. Right. Every place is different. People do different things, but just appreciating the differences is important. If you appreciate the differences, you don't get like, oh, why is it so noisy, loud, dirty, whatever the bad thing is, versus saying, you know what, it is what it is. So to me, I love the contrast. So when I was living in Japan, I'd go to places like Egypt, like Turkey, that were upside down.
Right, okay. Sure.
And when I lived in places like China, where it was upside down, I'd go to places like Singapore, where in Japan, where things are precise, because I like the opposites. But, you don't go there expecting, if the trains arrive in Egypt within an hour, you're happy versus within a minute in Japan.
But that's
all acceptance of what it is and embracing that rather than being angry and upset, because that's the joy of the world, I think.
I think I find, and I think unfortunately this happens often. And I think, look, with Americans, I think sometimes there's a little bit of ethnocentrism, and so sometimes, I don't want to mean I'm an American, but at the same time, sometimes people will go to a country and expect them to cater and behave the way they do. I don't think it's just Americans. I think a lot of cultures, and I think that that's unfair. And I think that people lose out on really getting to know a culture when they feel like theirs is the best and they're not willing to look at other approaches and other things. But I do want to get to something and then move to another section. So I think this is so fun to talk about. But we talked for a minute about the party culture, right? How it works. You go to Japan, you're doing business. We talked a little bit about the first party and the second one, and ends up in karaoke bar. But anyway, how culturally, really, I'm joking, but it does work in a certain way. How does that work?
People in Japan don't talk the truth, right, in the office. They all try to, figure out what the hell what does David mean by that? even when I try to speak Japanese, whatever, and try to explain it. And you go to a first party, and the boss will pay, right? I'll pay for the dinner. It'll be more formal, and there'd be, at the end of it, there'll be a simultaneous clap,
right?
Which I understand is some sort of militaristic view of background to it. But anyway, so I was just told that's part of the culture. But at the party, they'll start saying, this is what we do, and trying to understand what you meant by that strategy or that plan. And the second party, I would never go to, because second party would be they'd go to eat more food, and then they'd talk about what David said, what the boss said, and do we agree or don't agree, and have that Japanese never wash is the right word, I think, which is over alcohol, then discuss work and try to interpret it. And the third party is the bad party. That's the girly bar type thing.
I guess it depends who you are, right? The bad or right, exactly. But it's the karaoke girly bar, right? It's
and the colleagues would tell me that they'd go to these bars and they'd save their lunch money for weeks to spend on this girly bar, and I'd say, you're kidding me, right? You're going to go to this girly bar to buy someone a drink. And there's no sex. It's just the drink, and you're forgiving not having lunch for how many days? You're crazy. But it's just part of the culture.
Interesting. Well, we're not going to get too deep into that. I have a story, but I'm going to skip it. No, I actually have a story about an interesting experience when I was in Asia, but I'm going to skip it for today. We'll do that for another podcast. But it is interesting. That could be a whole nother conversation. But first of all, I want to ask just one question before we move to another area I want to talk about. But what approach do you think builds stronger teams? East versus West. How would you? I
think once you're conscious of the differences, and that's a lifetime of learning, Fred. You never really understand. But as you said, people are people, and if you treat people well and treat them as you want to be treated, then they get it. But then, I think to me, I've tried the same approach, right, and I've adapted it slightly a little bit here and there. So when I'm in the East, I will use more baby English, no big words. We keep it simple, talk even slower than I do, which is hard for me. But fundamentally, give people trust and tell them, look, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust you to do it. I don't want to micromanage you. I want you to grow. I want you to feel comfortable pushing your own barriers where you're not sure and learn from that, and demonstrate that. If you do those sort of things, people go, oh, okay, I think he means it. Actually, he doesn't mean it. So if I screw up, he's going to catch me, right? He's going to look after me and stand in front of the flak. If you do these sort of things, you get incredible loyalty over time. Now, it's painful because you get people goof off and do things that are silly, and you take the hit for them. And it's sometimes hard to do that, but actually it's the right thing to do. If I've had bosses do the opposite, which is usually the case, right? You kind of know they're not going to catch you. You need to catch yourself. And it's lovely to have a person to willing to take the hits for you, and then whether it's good and bad, because that comes with a part of the territory. That builds a strong team and a strong sense of purpose and mission. Once you have a purpose and mission that's strong, you can get anything done. It doesn't matter where you're working in. You can get, build mission to Mars or wherever you're going to. You can get it done because people are willing to go above and beyond.
And that's how you treat people, right? I was writing something just recently in a LinkedIn comment about when you treat people well, they'll go to the ends of the earth for you. And also when you lead them and treat them well, you make them feel like they're contributing and you're developing them, of course. But and that's the point, I think, part of the point you're making. But let's get into the CISO hot seat, because I think this is important. A lot of CISOs I think will benefit from this conversation because you've been in that seat, and we know the pressures everybody talks about, but what are some of the pressures that most people don't see? Let's just spend a few minutes on this.
Well, I think I always talk about the inherent pressure between the CIO and CISO, and I've written articles for CIO magazine about that. Because having been a CIO for 20 years of my life, and then seeing many CIOs just think cybersecurity is a pain. That's just downside and upside for them. And so they will steer away from being involved in that because if it's going to be an issue, it's Fred's problem. Okay, it's not my problem. And so that was shocking to me because as a CISO, I was always thinking, how do I support my CISO to get things done? And then to see CIOs act, I care about customer experience, Dave. I'm not going to put in MFA. And I said, well, hang on, sorry, we're being attacked by a bot in the US. Your country is being attacked but could be attacked by the same bot. You have the same version of mobile banking software. I don't care about customer experience. Being out is actually a bad customer experience. Right. And so seeing CIOs push back against that is shocking to me. Okay. Then I realized that actually when I was in HSBC, I had more support from the COOs, who the CIOs often reported to, than the CIOs themselves. And, I found that interesting. I didn't expect that. I expect, there's one or two CIOs that got it, and they got that they need to be supportive, and really be supportive in spirit and in person, versus actually saying, no, I want to stay as far away as I can from that because it's dangerous for me. But yeah, it's a interesting dilemma.
So I want to get into just a couple things here, and then I have so much more to talk about as it relates to you personally. But a couple things. Number one, I think this is so important. I think everybody in cyber, struggles with this. Why security is still seen as a cost and not a growth driver, and we can all see it in the cybersecurity industry. It's like right in front of us, but it seems like it continues to be a problem.
If you step back from it all, right? Cybersecurity, even in a flat budget, is often growing, or actually a large slice of the pie. So if you're a peer in the business or a peer as a CIO in one of the divisions, for example, you're saying, why are those guys getting all the money? Aren't they done yet? Aren't they done yet? So there's a bit of jealousy, I think, that happens there around that. And then also, as cyber professionals, we're not really good at the quantification, the cyber risk quantification, to say, we're doing this to reduce X number millions of dollars to reduce this risk and risk buy down of X, right? We often go there and say, we've got this regulation. It's a new thing that's up. It's DORA, it's whatever it is. And we're going to need $10 million to fix that, right? And then it's a fear and FUD and all that sort of aspect of we must have this money, otherwise we won't be able to pass DORA. Versus actually, we need to be compliant to DORA. We need to be passing the test. We don't need to be getting a distinction for that. But how do we really focus on reducing risk? And if you do that as well as being compliant, so you've got that sort of triple thread going on, right? You're able to, if possible, be compliant, right? Have a good customer experience and reduce risk. If you do all three things with one investment, fantastic, right? So how do you start driving towards that agenda versus just one of those pillars and saying, it's compliance, I must do this. That's a cop-out, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, look, I really think that we could have a roundtable just talking about that alone. I mean, that's a whole conversation about how to solve that and how to get CISOs to be able to speak to boards. And, that's another conversation I think we should in the future. We can bring a group together, but I did want to talk about something. So I know that, and this was fascinating. We started to talk about this a bit. Excuse me. At HSBC, you developed something called the Vulnerability Index, and it focused on identifying exactly who within your organization was vulnerable and why. And I think we talked about this, and OutThink emphasizes a similar approach. Instead of relying solely on generic compliance or policies, it highlights the importance of understanding human behavior to proactively reduce risk, you could say. So I wondered if you could explain, and you were kind of ahead of your time here, which is so cool. So could you explain exactly what the Vulnerability Index was, how you implemented, and I guess what kind of results or changes it drove within HSBC security culture?
Yeah, I think it's part of a journey, Fred, because I think the HSBC, when I got there, we had a lot, we're spending $1 billion in 4 years on cyber to uplift it, and uplifting the SOC, the Intel group, every group was being uplifted with tools and the like, but fundamentally, we went from being very data poor to being more data rich and saying, okay, we actually can start to see, I won't name brands, but these data analysis of use of these tools and where we are, and then we started thinking a bit about this as we took on the responsibility of thinking, well, have we got well-defined definitions for higher risk users? People with privileged access or administrative assistants, EAs for executives, all the people who've got the keys to the kingdom. Do we have a definition for those guys? Do we train them differently? Should we train them? Yes, the answer is yes. We should train them differently. We should give them harder phishing tests. We should give them more explicit, specific training that's targeted towards them. Whether they're a developer or whatever it is, right? And so we spent a lot of time trying to work that out. And then I kept thinking, actually, this is interesting because we're doing it very crudely. We're just measuring phishing and clicks and reporting. That's okay, but it's not really. It's all test lab stuff, right? It's we're doing it and people are doing it and we get click rates, and we had a really good culture of getting reporting happening in the business, and business CEOs were very proud to be. I'm at 2% click rate. I've got the lowest in the country, and that's great. But actually, can we look at this more broadly? To your point about the index, the idea was actually simple, which we collect all the information about Fred. If he's going to or trying to go to blacklisted sites, if he's trying to do things now with AI or things they shouldn't be doing, whether it's a DLP incident or whatever it is, we just collect information about your behavior. Whether you're actually being attacked through being blocked by the filters, or actually you're clicking phishing links or not doing the training, then we see you as being more vulnerable, and we need to give you more training. Because it's looking at you holistically as an asset, as the person, versus a small little slice of that being, phishing and reporting. And so it was an idea we had. I think it's the right thing to do because you're starting to unpeel and figure out, what is it? Is it behavior? Is it attitude? Is it our training's not good enough? How do we be more tailored towards it?
So, I mean, I guess. And, I've been now cybersecurity. It's hard to believe it's almost a decade. So I fell into this, never intended to be in cybersecurity, but how I never looked back. Well, maybe sometimes I did, but all joking aside, it's amazing to be in an industry that really is at the inception. And you really were a pioneer back then talking about that. But the way that companies are approaching training without sort of individualizing it, do you think that's a problem? Does there need to be a complete rebrand of training in the industry?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. I think gamification is good. I mean, we saw that, within because we're doing two levels. We're doing the awareness training for general 300,000 people in HSBC. We're also doing the training for the staff, the cyber staff as well, right? But certainly, the young kids like the immersive labs, that things that are actually gamified and there's a leaderboard and the thing. But fundamentally, if we look at the example with the DevOps side, Fred, how do you make sure that there's the right carrot and sticks for these things? And HSBC had a tool we used, and we had bought it for 25,000 developers and probably using about 20%, 15% of that. And I said, this is all, it's not the tool, it's actually how we're using it. So we just need to make sure that for developers, we say there's a white belt training. You got to do a white belt to minimum one course a year, and then the yellow belt and different levels, right, up to black belt. But then how do we then go from 20% adoption to 100% adoption in 8 months, which is what we did. I said, let's just measure it. Let's have data, and let's start pushing Fred and David. Why is your team at 15%? I want you to be 100% in 6 months' time. And then saying that's a minimum. We expect that, otherwise it'll be reported in risk committees. So you start to make it a stick versus like, oh, we're going to give you this free iPad. We're going to give you this free, iPhone if you join this group.
Right.
It didn't work. It didn't work. And people tried that for years and basically spent license money, right, but not had high adoption. So sometimes you need to be a bit hard-minded about it and get stuff done so you can move on to the next stage.
Excuse me, I interrupted you.
Mm-hmm. No, good.
So no, I agree with you. And I think, look, it's got to change. The industry's going to be better. Humans are going to be able to protect, humans still are important, right? Machines can't do everything. So, we have to find a way to make human risk not a risk anymore and turn into a, not into a liability anymore is what I'm saying.
Yeah, the human firewall.
Thank you. I was struggling with my words for a moment. Exactly. And so, we can talk more about that, but let's move on because we've covered so much today. But I'd be remiss if I didn't get into. Look, you've had a long, successful career, many countries. We've talked about it, but have you developed any type of personal framework or philosophy to keep yourself on your A game consistently? Like, how do you do that? I know that look, we talked about it. I know that there's a lot of things you do. So why don't you talk for a moment about that and how you handle that?
Yeah, I think coping, all of us have resilience. To me, resilience is all about elasticity, right? Be able to bounce back. And all of us take it differently. So I'm talking about my dad, mental illness and stuff. How do you not succumb to that? How do you be strong to understand what you can and can't do? And then figure out that, I need to have time for myself. That time can be different things. For me, it was yoga. I embraced yoga. I did, yoga at 7:00 most mornings, and I'd do an hour of yoga, and I'd come out feeling fresh. But also this mindfulness of thinking, you're not trying to do it, but you're thinking about the pose and the movement and the alignment you have, and etc. Then you're going, actually, what's really important today is to do that. If I do that today, I'm good. Because as a CISO, you've got all these things coming at you, right? Sure. There's a board report, there's an incident, there's, some steering committees, the risk committee papers, 15 things, 20 things coming at you. But if I can get that one thing done, I'm gold, right? And if you can have that peace of mind, clarity, thinking to prioritize and reprioritize, that helps you survive and thrive because you're then letting the dust settle around the emotions and people really pushing you to do versus what I want to do to be a good leader.
And I'm sure that yoga helps you to focus and realize that you may have 20 things in your head, but once you center, right, you focus on what the main goal is. So I should take you up on that. So there's a few more things. You have a 9-day transformation plan. I think we talked about, right? That's how you help turn around security teams. So tell us about that for a moment.
Yeah, that's as I mentioned, that's something that I talk about in the book, which is that you start off by doing it yourself by saying, here's my one page across people, process, technology, things I'm going to be focused on, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. That sets the tone, which is I'm going to be looking at making these changes, doing these things with a longer term view in mind. But this what I'm working on now is connected. There's dots going to get connected, right? And so whether it's about people or it's about the strategy, whether it's about fixing hygiene issues, you've thought through it and you're being transparent about it, then your team starts, okay, I should think this way as well. So I've had teams who actually then would actually adopt this as a rolling 90-day plan for themselves. Not everybody did it, right? And I didn't force it and say you must do this, but it's trying to role model that you're thinking this way. What have you done for me lately is important, right? Because you can't just be resting on what you did last year or last month. Yeah.
So I wanted to just, on a side note, I'm looking here. So I turn my head sometimes because I got my WhatsApp going and I got, our executive producer and some other folks here sending me messages sometimes like speed it up or, the usual stuff. And I just got a message saying that I just got a message and my executive producer is saying that I need to do yoga and it'll help me. So I think maybe Dave, we can do a video yoga one day. We can, right? Yeah, it would benefit me, huh? Being very ADD and not always having 100 things in my mind. It probably would benefit me, correct?
I think so. I think I do all kinds of yoga now, but I started off by one stage doing Bikram yoga. If you,
what is that?
It's 90 minutes at about 45 degrees Celsius, which is about 100 plus Fahrenheit temperature.
And dry, it's Australia, right? Right.
Yeah, no, it's an international movement, but you basically 90 minutes of exercise in this hot movement, and I can't remember if it's 28 or whatever poses. So it's not that many poses, but it's flexibility, it's strength, it's being able to just stand in that heat, and you flush all your toxins out of your body. You lose a liter of water in that period of time. But it's
like going in a sweat lodge with Native Americans, right? Right. I know people have done that actually and passed out. Yeah.
But it's I think I wrote a story about this many years ago about this for CI magazine about it's a good analogy for being transformation. You're transforming yourself and you're trying to lead the right way and have the right form and even when you feel not great, you don't want to show it. You got to just hold your form.
Sure.
And then that's part of leadership, right? Because you sometimes may be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm screwing up today or it's not going well, but you can't show that. You've got to just be calm, be considered and be thoughtful. What's the right thing to do here? Right. Even though you're going, I actually don't know what to do. But, you got to then engage the team to get you to help you.
Right. So by the way, I just got, these young bucks send me messages, I'm old. I don't even know they know all the hip stuff. Apparently it's called hot yoga in the US. So
hot yoga, right?
For them, hot yoga apparently. And what do I know? Right. Exactly. So, there we go. But I know that, thinking 2 jobs ahead, you talked about it earlier. It's another one of your mindset. We covered that earlier. And I know that that's important. And then, you already talked about your son's story, right? And we talked about deliberately exposing, your kids to diverse learning styles, which helped, he went through some situations, right? It's your son, right?
Yeah,
he had some difficulties initially and he doesn't, that went away, right?
I think the people who came to this method, Fred, had a kid with learning disabilities and born slightly brain damaged. My son was never brain damaged, but they realized actually the same techniques work on normal kids. And you supercharge their learning abilities. And so my son's super smart. Sorry, if you watch this, will hate me saying that, but and that's because time he was 12 months old, he'd been to the zoo 12 times. He just got stimulation. We just took him to see things.
Oh, but he also had fun and he learned. Exactly.
Yeah,
I think it's so important to have both,
when you're doing
right?
these cards, it's not root learning. It's actually you're doing these cards for like 10 seconds. 15 seconds, whatever it is, for twice a day. So it's actually make it fun. You smile. You make it because learning has to be fun. Of course.
I mean, look, there's always these philosophies. I remember, and I want to ask you one last question here, but there's a Waldorf mode too. The Waldorf story, the Waldorf schools where they say kids don't get to play enough, right? Whatever. And I'm saying there has to be, but there has to be both. I think, kids also need to sometimes just have fun as well. And it sounds like you did it from an educational perspective, but going to the zoo, that's fun. And and I think learning, and I think that we talked about for training perspective. Yeah, people have to learn the way they learn. And if you don't enjoy it and you're miserable, then why are you going to be interested? I learned through reading novels. I loved when I was a little kid, historical fiction to help me understand the world on some level. And I think that's the key, right? Yeah. And so would you agree? I mean, on some level, as a leader.
Having fun, Fred, is part of it, right? For sure. You want to always, in life, have fun or don't bother. Seriously.
Yeah.
If it's a job you don't like, then don't do it. Okay.
Right. No, of course. Or find a way to do it and maneuver it so that you can have fun. So on that note, man, I've had so much fun here, but I want to, I want you to tell us what's the best leadership advice you've ever received? I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but
gosh. Well, I think the past to others is one that I always remember as that's been formative to me to actually think about making others better. That's always traveled with me. I don't know if there's any other ones that pop out. I think I've observed role models and say, I like what that person's doing. There's a guy called Bryce Clement. He was ended up being CIO at Eli Lilly, and
right.
he was very generous. He was always, in the management committee, always wanted to know what everybody thought. Then he made a decision, because it was his decision, but he wanted to make sure everybody had involvement, engagement, and then he said, "Okay, thank you for your input. We're going to do this." And I thought, wow, that's so empowering, because you listen to, it's thoughtful, and then he makes sure all the team gets a chance to add to the decision, and then he makes the decision and he owns it. That was great role modeling for how I wanted to operate myself. And I think all of us can look at different people and take those pieces together and make your own Frankenstein of what good looks like, because that's how you define that baseline.
And I like that, because I've worked in many different types of places, and I've been involved with lots of different organizations. And one thing I've noticed is that oftentimes it seems like a constant theme. People don't feel like they're able to give feedback. So I think when you implement that, and understandably, so I think that's so important. But listen, David, this has been an incredible conversation. We talked about cybersecurity, but also, leadership, resilience, breaking barriers, stress. But there is one question that still lingers in my mind, and I have to ask you this before we wrap up. What advice would today's David give the 10-year-old chubby David?
Yeah, that's interesting. Look, I think it would be pretty much, mate, you got this. You can do it. Trust yourself. Trust your instincts. Whatever you have, you can also change. So keep trying to make yourself a better version of yourself, because I think that self-doubt, we all have self-doubt, right? And then you get reinforcement by success. So, I think self-belief, self-confidence is important, but then be able to have a shot at something and then say, okay, this is good. I can keep building towards something better. And so, but definitely, I think, all of us have that potential to be better. And so we just need to define that for ourselves.
First of all, David, that was beautiful. I feel like I have grown throughout this episode, and there's nothing better when you spend time with somebody and you really get to engage. And we had a chance to spend, more time, last week. And when we grow and learn from each other, that's like really the most important thing, evolving as human beings. And so thank you. I so appreciate this. And thanks for joining us. And I just wanted to say, speaking of breaking barriers, next episode, we're going to be doing something big for folks listening or watching. We're bringing together influential women in cybersecurity. Now, it was Women's History Month, so it's going to be a little bit delayed, but, these things take time to put together, but it's going to be a no BS high impact roundtable on how women are not just making space in this industry, but they're shaping it now. And I'm so excited to talk about that. It's more than just about diversity, because it's about true leadership, new paradigms, and the future of security. And we're calling it Women Hacking the Quo, because these leaders aren't just part of cybersecurity. They're leading it, evolving it, and pushing it forward in ways the industry has never seen before. And many of them are my friends and colleagues that I've gotten to know over the years. So I'm excited about that. So if you think cybersecurity is just a boys' club, things are changing. Think again, and you're not going to want to miss this one. So again, David, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've had a great time with you. We're going to do this again. We're going to do roundtables, and this is the Engaged and Secure podcast, of course, brought to you by OutThink. Again, I'm Fred Menachem, 0 to 60 and nothing in between. Until next time, stay secure, stay ahead, and keep thinking differently. Thanks again, David.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on Engage and Secure, where conversations inspire action and collaboration drives innovation. Powered by OutThink, we're dedicated to transforming how leaders address cyber-human risk, paving the way for a safer digital future. Don't miss our upcoming episodes and roundtable conversations with industry trailblazers. Subscribe, share, and join us as we redefine what's possible in cybersecurity. Until next time, stay secure and stay inspired.